Hello and a warm welcome to the CNBC Africa special. I'm Kukulethu Cele. Well, today we speak to a well-respected businessman who has covered and traveled many continents in his explorations to be a bold entrepreneur. Rakesh Wahi, who's the co-founder as well as vice chairman of the ABN Group, joins us this afternoon. Good to have you with us today, Sam. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you very much, Gugu.
The reason for our conversation today is this phenomenal book, which intrigued me by the title, Be a Lion, and perhaps that's the best place to start. I understand you've traveled to many zoos across the world, and you've always had a fascination and, most importantly, a respect for a lion, which is a natural-born leader in its environment.
Well, I guess, every human being has a fascination for different animals, and perhaps it's a bit reflective of your own characteristics in many ways. And so I was always fascinated by this animal, principally because of the reverence all other animals have towards a lion. The way a lion conducts himself, in a pride, being, at the table before everybody else, doesn't necessarily have to go to battle, but is always there to protect the tribe. So, it's just been a fascination, and every time I've gone to the zoo, I've never come away without actually having visited the lion's den. And having come to South Africa, I remember going many times to the lion park and spending time there and just watching this animal. It's just fascinating.
Well, clearly there are certain characteristics that resonate with you, but I want us to go back perhaps before your journey in entrepreneurship started, where you were based in the military. And that was actually the source and foundation of many of the leadership skills that you've actually learned.
I joined the army soon after school. I went to the National Defence Academy, which is India's premier officer training academy. It's similar to West Point or some of the other institutions around the world. And there's a very intensive process to recruit officers into the Indian Army. Just to give you statistics, 400,000 people apply to join the NDA every year. 10,000 are called for interviews, and only 300 are selected. Now that is a very rigorous exercise, and so when you select officers into the Indian Army, you're selecting the best of the best. So that's where it all started. And when we were growing up in the 70s, you didn't have a lot of opportunities around. So you either became a doctor, an accountant, engineer, or you joined the forces. And in my case, I'm a second generation soldier. My father had been in the forces, and it was a natural attraction to follow what your dad does. And I always wanted to do my engineering, which I had an opportunity to do through the army. I became an engineer in the army. I served with the Corps of Engineers and trained on a lot of things related to the Corps of Engineers, which is bridging, anti-tank warfare, demolitions. So I specialized in all these areas. And it was a very, very interesting time of my life.
One can only imagine, especially the rigorous training that you'd had to go through, and some of the visuals are also displayed in the book. But you mentioned elements that are quite critical. The leadership role that your father played and the influence that he had on your life. I also understand that you also served under Colonel Jagannathan within the military, and he also was quite strict, but taught you incredible lessons with regard to the direction that you hope to take into your life.
Colonel Jagannathan, I think, was one of the greatest influences in my life. When I joined the military, he was really hard on me. And the first thing he actually put into my head was that don't worry about where you've come from or who you are or who your father is. He says, you are mine now. And he was absolutely brutal in his expectations.
No sick days, right?
No sick days. He actually said, you actually get sick when you die. So his principles were something that I always lived with, and I think he just tempered me so well into all aspects of leadership. His basic fundamental value was look after your people, be with your people wherever they are. Even if there was one person out on duty, he made sure that the officer in charge was with him. So I think it was about just making sure that you looked after the people, because at the end of the day, no mission can be achieved unless you're able to motivate your people. And in the military, the motivation is of a completely different order. You're actually motivating people around patriotism, to give up their lives for a particular objective. So how do you motivate a person to give up his life? And that, I think, is the greatest skill that the army teaches you.
On that note, though, again alluding to people and your transition out of the army and into, I understand, Russia as well as the UAE, where you started flexing your muscle when it came to your entrepreneurship as well as business activities. But the decision to leave the army, I understand, was quite a brave one back in 1988.
I think one of the things I've always told people is, if you want to do something in your life, you must do it. Because you live once, you must live it well. You must live it for the values you believe in. I had a near-death experience when I was in the military, and I think that was a turning point in my life. Till then, I was a bit, I would say, reserved in many ways, and wasn't very outgoing. I was quite happy with what I was doing. And then when I had this accident on our Western Front, it was a near-death experience. I was actually airlifted out to our command hospital. And when I was in hospital, I had the opportunity of reading Ayn Rand again. And, it's an author that I've greatly respected and loved. Rand means different things to different people. And, when I reread her books when I was in hospital, I realized that, it's a time to make a transition. And her philosophy has always been about, oneself and about, doing things that come to you. And I just thought that it was a good time to look at a transition. And perhaps that was the turning point when I started thinking a bit differently. I changed the way I used to react to circumstances. Whenever I wanted to do something, I went out and did it. And so when I thought about the world outside, and this was an opportunity I had when I was at the Antarctic, I decided to quit the army and try out something totally different. And I just feel that was the greatest decision I made at that time.
Mm-hmm. It seems as though you've always been one for adventure as well as growth, not only the Antarctic, but you've also led a significant team, especially individuals also from CNBC Africa to Mount Kilimanjaro, and I understand working with other colleagues at Mount Everest. So are you an adventurous spirit? Is that something that's always been innate within you?
I think the military, and also, I was in a boarding school, and I found that, a lot of activities were around adventure. And one of the things that adventure does is actually brings people together. You may not really be able to test people in a boardroom or inside a corporate environment, but the minute you go out and you're put through hardship of any kind, you find that, the real colors of people come out, and you can actually see born leaders from people who, don't care about others. And that's a very important aspect when you're out there. As an example, when we had gone up on Kilimanjaro, we went out as 15 different people because, in the context of South Africa, because most of the team was from here, there were people from different ethnic backgrounds. And when we went up that mountain, I gave them one simple mission. I said, 100% of us are going to make it to the top. It doesn't matter how long we take, but the objective is that we're not going to leave anyone behind. And on the last night, we went through a lot of hardship, but at the end of it, we went slow, steady, and we all made it to the top. And our chief guide at that time told us, he said that out of the 100-odd groups that he had taken up the mountain, we were only the 10th group that actually made it 100% to the top. So it was a big thing that, we were all able to stay together, and there were 5 ladies on our team, and each of them actually made it to the top. So it was just fantastic. And when anyone was down, somebody else came in and just gave a little nudge, a little shoulder, a bit of a hug, gave some tea, coffee, and the people just kept going up.
Sticking with the people element, again, it proves to be quite influential in your book as well with regard to your journey and the different people who played critical roles in your life. I want us to also refer to Rick Michaels, who I understand opened up the door for you and broadened your thinking when it came to the landscape of investment banking and identifying business opportunities.
One of my philosophies has been that people come into your life for a reason. I'm a great believer in the time-space, philosophy, that when you meet somebody, it's not just happened as a coincidence. Actually, I don't believe in coincidences. I think that when things happen, they're happening for a reason. And when somebody comes into your life, you must actually take advantage of it. Not just, and I mean advantage in a very good sense. It's about understanding how you can influence each other. How do you build interdependence with people? In life, you cannot achieve success on your own. It has to be on the strength of the people around you. If you want to achieve something big, uh, it, it's not something you can do all by yourself. So when I met Rick, it was in '94, and I was, leading the life of a maverick in Russia at that time. And here was this very successful entrepreneur who had built a business, with $2,000, starting out in his garage in 1973, and he built one of the greatest investment banking franchises in the world. And I was so fascinated by him. And at the end of our first meeting, he said, "Look, why don't you join me?" And I asked him. I said, we're poles apart. I had a military background. I'd been doing, trading in Russia, and banking was something I was totally unfamiliar with. And he said, "Look, I have a very good feeling about, this dinner and the way we've got along." And he invited me to the US, and we never looked back from there. We had a fantastic run after that for 8 years, which was just, to my mind, it opened everything, as you said. And I was able to actually get into an area which, I'm so proud of today. Went into emerging markets, started looking at investing into, startup ventures around the world. And I think it opened my eyes into, the future, into what was happening, because their specialization was in the media and telecommunications industries. And that is exactly where I spend the rest of my life.
On that note as well, I want us to venture into the movements that you made into emerging markets. You are certainly a very brave man who grew up in Delhi, did business in Russia, came and conquered the continent, also have establishments in the UAE, and I understand your partnership as well with Safar Siddiqui also contributed significantly to that. But where does this element of braveness come from? And is it innate in entrepreneurs to venture into markets where everyone says, don't go there, too much risk?
Yeah, I can, summarize this in the form of an example. When we were looking at setting up an IT company in Sri Lanka, there was a war going on. And even when my partner, Lars Jefferson, and we went to even speak to Microsoft, they said, "Look, there's a war going on there. What are you guys going to do with Microsoft?" And they were covering the market from India. And we set that business up with 3 people in 2003. And it's a 700 people business now, spread across 7 countries in South and Southeast Asia. And we built one of the greatest technology companies as a small and medium-sized enterprise. And it all originated from the fact that you're able to take risks. You firstly have to understand that there is an opportunity. Problems are going to be there in every market that you look at. Emerging markets are not easy. But if you have a sound business plan, there is no reason, and if you've got a great gut about it, go ahead and do it. And then you've got to commit yourself to it. So that's how it all started. And then in 2002, I also met Zafar, who was at that time, he's a former KPMG partner. He got into media as well. I also always say that, his story is very much like Mel Brooks and the movie Producers, where he suddenly got behind a camera and started producing content for major television stations from around the world. Out of Pakistan, and then he came to Dubai, where we met, and he was setting up CNBC Arabia at that time, and we never looked back, the two of us, after that. We went out and set up CNBC Africa, and then together set up all our educational businesses.
Let's come to Africa, purely because I have a bias being African myself, but a very difficult and tough environment. And you entered just before the 2008-2009 financial crisis. And the nuances is something that also stands out in your book regarding the level of infrastructure in a country like South Africa, but some regulatory hurdles that needed to be crossed versus the likes of Rwanda and even Nigeria, where there's interesting juxtapositions regarding these markets.
I think the attraction to Africa in general came after the visit to South Africa in 2004. And I think South Africa is a great country. It's a great watermark for any international investor. It actually gives a different vision into Africa than what you see in general media, which is what we were exposed to prior to coming here. I'd never been south of Egypt until 2004. And coming here was an eye-opener in many ways. Just looking at the infrastructure, the quality of people, very sound institutions. So South Africa was, I think, the real reason that we got encouraged when we came here. After that, of course, we've gone across the rest of the continent. I'd also traveled to Nigeria. Nothing in the African continent ever stood out as something that was a major impediment in any way to taking decisions to invest.
But the deal nearly didn't happen, right, with CNBC Africa?
The main reason was that we couldn't get carriage on DSTV. And that's been the biggest challenge for a media or a television business in Africa, is that you don't have adequate distribution. And in 2004 and 5, it was a big challenge, because most satellite capacity was restricted. You didn't have terrestrial distribution. In most other countries, you've got very advanced cable TV businesses, but Africa lags almost about 15 to 20 years than most Asian markets, and I'm not even comparing it with Europe and the US. So I think there were some challenges there on distribution, but once we got that ironed out, we felt that the opportunity of setting up a quality business media conglomerate on the continent was the right time for us. There was a lot of doom and gloom being talked about on the continent. Africa has always been on a very negative kind of portrayal by a lot of media companies, and we felt that the opportunity to actually change that, because a lot of companies from around the world are making money here. They're taking a lot out of here, whether it's in resources, whether it's in oil. So I thought that we should talk about some of these stories as well. And there's so much happening on the continent that it was a great opportunity for us to actually take advantage of.
Looking at the bureaus that you opened up, spanning the cross-continent and various markets, but you did take a blow from the financial crisis slightly. And I want us to draw on the level of resilience that you and several of the investors also showed with regard to the wins and the challenges that you faced, but still maintain on the end objective of driving the growth in this entity that now has become a bigger ABN Group.
In any emerging market, and the 2008 crisis was something unprecedented. I had seen the 94 crisis in Asia. We'd gone through the dot-com bust. But what happened in 2008 was absolutely unprecedented. So the scale at which it happened, the reasons that led to it, the repercussions from that were significant. And we had to quickly go back to the drawing board, because when you get hit as a startup into a global recession that you have no idea around the magnitude of, we had to actually redefine our business model. And I think we were, with the support of our shareholders, and I must mention, the IDC was just a fantastic partner to have through this period. They've got a long-term vision. They believe in what we are doing, and perhaps that's one of the things that I've talked about in my book, is that when you choose your shareholders, you must find people who are looking for the long term and not short term, because a lot of startup businesses take a lot longer to get to fruition. Media is one of them, and education is the other, because education is another business that you cannot make quick returns on. You have to invest into the long term. And so we were able to actually relook at our business model. We were able to consolidate the businesses and emerge from there stronger than we were. And I think this process of evolution and moving your business model around and adapting to it, to the local requirements, is something what business is all about over an extended period of time.
I know you're also very passionate about education as well as philanthropy, and was a critical and key player when it came to the establishment of the Murdoch University as well as Lancaster, I understand, in Ghana, if I'm not mistaken. What's your take on the level of contribution or focus that we have on education, whether it be in South Africa or over the continent? And is it sufficient? Because we really are living in a digital age where things change on a continual basis.
I come from a country which has actually paid a lot of emphasis on education. The Indian education system is very strong, and part of the reason why we produce such strong engineers and doctors and professionals who are now working in most of the major companies around the world is because we have a very strong foundation on education. In Africa, depending on which part of the continent you go to, whether it's South Africa or go to Nigeria or some of the other economies, you find that the priorities of governments are different, because the countries are in different stages of evolution. To my mind, I think the responsibility of government is to provide basic education for everybody. That basically means that you provide education up to secondary level, up to metric or whichever be the passing exam for school. After that, I think government needs to take a step back and focus on other priorities and let the private sector work hand in hand with the government. So it's not something that the government can do alone. It's also not necessary that everybody who passes out of school must go to university. There are so many other vocations available. In fact, there are people in the developed world who make more money as artisans than professionals, and it's because there is dignity of labor. So you shouldn't feel that just because you're a plumber or an electrician, you're any less than anybody else. You make a better living, you can provide for your families, and the job market is there for you. So I think if you look at this holistically, the opportunities on the continent are huge. When we did our research around tertiary education, we found that you could set up 500 universities in Africa and you'll still be short. And that's the scale at which this business is going to grow over the next 20 to 30 years. The demand is huge. The number of children coming out of schools is, there's thousands and thousands of kids coming out. There's about 500,000 kids that go out to the Western world for education every year, and a lot of foreign exchange goes out. These kids don't come back to the country of origin because they find jobs overseas. So you're losing a lot in Africa, which is why we thought that we want to bring global brands into the African continent. So we partnered Lancaster University, which is in the top 10 British universities. It's the 4th ranked business school in the UK. And we set up a campus in Ghana, and we're happy that we've got about 600 students there already in the first 2 years, and we think that that campus will grow to about 5,000. We are setting it up as a center of excellence for engineering.
I want us to take this opportunity to reflect on the level of giving that you've done. I know that you have several philanthropic initiatives. Even the proceeds from your book will go to the ABN Trust. At what point in your journey did you realize that it's no longer about you, where you were satisfied with the money that you've achieved, you're satisfied with the stature that you've maintained in public, and made it about other people?
I think this, giving back is not something that comes by turning off a switch. So it's part of your character. It's things that are part of you as you grow up. I've seen my parents spend a large part of their life giving back. My mother was involved in setting up vocation centers for women. She worked very closely with Mother Teresa, and both my parents have actually spent their lives doing things for others. My wife comes from a family that has also set up charitable institutions. They've got a school currently in North India where they look after 4,000 kids through primary and secondary education. So this is not something which we were unfamiliar with when we were growing up. We saw these acts of kindness, right through our childhood. So through the process, of our journey, a lot of times it is not just cash that you're contributing, you're also contributing in terms of time and other activities that you get engaged with. But what we always did was that whenever we found people in need, we supported it. So earlier it was closer to home. Whenever there were requests from anywhere, we made sure that those were that we went over and beyond. So if we had to cut some of our own needs, we would still continue to support some of these requests that we received. But a lot of it was unstructured. So whenever things happened, we would be involved in them, but at an arm's length. We got involved with some projects where there was an electrification of villages in India. They were setting up schools in some of the villages. So we would contribute wherever it was required. In 2011, particularly after we came to South Africa and we saw some of the conditions over here, a lot of your charitable activities get involved into the communities that you actually do business in or around. And we saw what was going on with some of the orphanages over here. My wife, had the opportunity to go to Tutuzela, which is an orphanage in Alex. A lot of these children were, bitten by rats. Some of them were HIV infected, and I think we felt that as a family, we wanted to put a kind of mission for ourselves, and we took orphanages as one. And the second was to send children through financial journalism, an area where we felt that since we had businesses around that area, we could also provide job opportunities and internships and everything else. So those two became the turning points for us. So in 2011, we set up the ABN Education Trust, and that's been a little more structured in terms of what we're doing now, and we're taking that activity across the continent as well. We gave our first bursary in Rwanda actually this year.
Fantastic. Well, we look forward to what developments come out from that market. We're wrapping up the interview, and I think we've just touched the tip of the iceberg with regard to the various topics that we can touch on from your book. You mentioned that leaving a legacy is a lifetime of consistent actions in your book. And I want to ask you what you believe your legacy will be. And more importantly, what's the next chapter for you going forward?
I think legacies are not something that you plan. A legacy is a lifetime of consistent actions, and I've talked about it in the book. But I was inspired to write about legacies when I visited Charles University in Prague at the end of last year. And when I was walking through the corridors of this university, particularly when we went to the chapel, here's a place 700 years old. Now, this was the oldest university. I thought I had been to some very distinguished places of learning, but this was just fantastic. 700 years. And Charles IV, he may be remembered for a lot of other things, but what he's really remembered for is Charles University. It's the areas of medicine, of sciences that they actually built in this country. And that got me thinking that when you're setting up these projects and you're setting up these places of learning, this is what is going to survive us all. Because as people go through these corridors and they get degrees from these universities and they benefit from these places of learning, they're going to carry that for the rest of their lives. Somebody can watch a CNBC program, but he's not going to remember that. But when they have a degree from one of the universities that you've established, 100 years from today, we hope that these will survive us all. And that is what a legacy is, that you leave something for the future, you leave something that people remember. And it's not about money. People will never remember you for the wealth that you've generated for yourself. They'll always remember you for the way you've touched people and the things that you've done which basically outlive everybody. So I think, this was though it's the shortest chapter in my book, I think it's something that was the closest to my heart when I wrote it.
Thank you so much for your time today, sir. Well, that brings our conversation to an end with the Vice Chairman as well as co-founder of the ABN Group, Mr. Rakesh Wahi, on the back of his book, Be a Lion.